think I am recording now. At least I should be. All right, so let's talk about Cold War a little bit more. I think, any questions on the partitioning process that we talked about yesterday, and how the partition process, first off, that's important for you to understand, because, in many ways that's, the state of Texas, what will they ask you about that? That's primarily going to be based on the idea of containment, okay? Why do you create a partition? Well, you create a partition to contain something. And so the policy of containment begins pretty quick after the end of World War II. You have, particularly, you have these emerging tensions by 46, 47. You have what is called the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is the first step in containment. Now, it's think of it as the official kind of presidential policy, although containment embodies more than the Truman Doctrine in practice, okay? So the Truman Doctrine is a response specifically to Soviet finagling and manipulation. Doesn't that sound familiar? Like Greece and around the Black Sea, around Turkey and that kind of stuff. So the Soviets are trying to extend their sphere of influence pretty quickly. And Truman's like, he's not going to have any of that. And so he issues his doctrine, which essentially says that the United States will send whatever aid it has to help countries, to help free peoples resisting subjugation, blah, blah, blah. Your typical grandiose language. So, in essence, we send some battleships to the Mediterranean. We send a bunch of aid to Greece. We funnel more money into the military to kind of increase our presence globally. This is combined with Winston Churchill calling for the Iron Curtain, which is kind of that line that really is kind of that area where the Soviets had swept in, those countries in Eastern Europe that have not been allowed to have democratic elections, okay, or had elections that were not entirely democratic.
Why is it called Iron Curtain?
Because Churchill says, and there's a cartoon somewhere that shows Churchill looking at this thing. Basically, the idea is that you cannot get through, that it's a curtain made of iron. It's dropped across. You can't, unlike a fabric curtain where you could have influence, right? Basically, the democratic nations cannot have any influence in Eastern Europe at the risk of having war, right? And it truly is, if you in that Google map that I shared on Classroom, if you look at the Iron Curtain part of it, you can see why he would call it a curtain, because it kind of has that look to it, I guess. And so this is all kind of part of what's going to happen with containment. So this is where this partition process becomes very important, as Truman has created his doctrine that says we're going to aid people resisting communism. And then you throw into that the fact that the Soviets will test a nuclear bomb approximately 1948. I might be off a little on that, but it's right around there. And so they will test an atomic bomb, and that's going to freak everybody out. The U.S. is going to go, whoa, they already have one? What do you mean? We thought they were a few years away from that. So it's not long after that you're going to have this diplomat by the name of George Kennan issue what he calls the Long Telegram. And he proposes in the Long Telegram this policy of containment that actually builds upon the Truman Doctrine, which is, if we can help keep countries from falling to communism, i.e. Truman Doctrine, and if we can contain it, partition it, keep it where it's already at, so we don't have to break through that curtain. We can let the Iron Curtain stand because we don't want to trigger another war. But if we can just keep it there, it will eventually collapse on its own. Okay? Well, he's right. It does. It just takes longer. And so the idea is that we're going to resist expansion and spheres of influence by the Soviets and by communism. Now, again, we kind of conflate Asian communism with Soviet communism, right? This is a valid issue with Soviet communism. It's a little different with Asian communism. And had we understood that in 1948, I think things would have been very different. But we did not understand that. And there's a whole historical analysis about how the State Department was run and how misinformation and how experts that understood China and Asia were intentionally fired because they didn't give their bosses the information they wanted. And so then we have this messed up policy in Asia that leads to Korea and Vietnam. The other thing you're going to see, and we'll be looking at this more specifically after, and we'll probably look at an excerpt of this on Tuesday, but we'll be going into depth on this after the STAR test. Because after the STAR test, the Eastfield Objective Essay is based in part on NSC 68. Okay? So this notion of what NSC 68 is, you have the National Security Council, which we still have today. It collects information from a variety of sources and makes recommendations. They make a recommendation to Truman that, and this is around 1950, I think it is, 50-ish, that basically we need to prepare our military. We need massive military spending. We also need to convince the American public that, again, is a little bit skittish about this whole global responsibility thing. Okay, the U.S. struggles with that. Okay, we struggle with that mantle of we're supposed to lead the world. And clearly after World War II, this is the direction we're going, right? We're going to, like I said, hold up that mirror and kind of try to recreate the rest of the world in our image. And so the U.S., the general populace, though, struggles with that, okay? And that's why we have these periods of isolationism and all that kind of stuff. So NSC 68 says we need a propaganda campaign, essentially. I don't think they technically called it propaganda, but that's what it was. To convince the American public that, yes, we need to commit to opposing communism, that we need to spend a lot of money on our military. Also suggests that we are woefully unprepared if there were to be a war. Lots of analysis about the strengths and weaknesses of the Soviet system, lots of analysis of the strengths and the weaknesses of the American system. And so the NSC 68 really kind of begins to make this framework for the Cold War. That we have to oppose it because any gain by the Soviets, any gain by communism in general, is an existential threat to us. Their way of life is so diametrically opposed to our way of life that they can't, that we have to fight them at every turn. And so it really kind of defines the Cold War. So when you add those things up together, the Truman Doctrine, the long telegram / containment, and NSC 68, you can see where this premise of the Cold War comes from. That what you have is really kind of this long sustained period of, silent hatred, and convincing the American public about who we are as opposed to the Soviet Union, okay? And it's good to realize kind of what that is. So the Truman Doctrine, some of the things that come about that are directly related to the Truman Doctrine are going to be the Marshall Plan and the Berlin Airlift. And I think I mentioned the Berlin Airlift the other day as kind of the beginning of that partition process, the beginning of that tension and frustration. You have the Berlin blockade. The Berlin Airlift is successful. He lifts the blockade. And so you have this period of approximately 10 years. The Berlin Wall does not begin construction, or they don't begin construction on it until 1961. It's a direct result of the U-2 spy plane. So the U.S. was spying on the Soviets at the end of the 1950s, like 1959. And what's interesting is we had started in 1959 actually kind of talking to, we'd invited the Soviets here, and Richard Nixon has this big debate about the standard of living in the United States and all this kind of stuff. And then this U-2 spy plane gets shot down, and kind of the building of the Berlin Wall is in part an official reaction to the U-2 spy plane. We can't trust Americans, we think they're spying on us, trying to take information from us. Now, the real problem is, by 1961, you have a lot of East Germans that are escaping into West Germany by getting into Berlin and getting into West Berlin and getting out that way. So that's really the problem. And in the game of the Cold War, You want to prove that your people like your system. Your system has to be the best. So this Cold War, while it has this definite military element to it, it also has very much this socio-cultural element to it. And that's why the 1950s society is what it is, to be honest with you. So the blockade and the airlift is the beginning of that process, okay? But you have those 10 years there where we're kind of in limbo, okay? So Truman does the airlift, that's successful, blockade's over. Marshall Plan, so as Europe's trying to rebuild in 48, 49, 50, there's a lot of concern that countries like France are becoming a little bit communistic, right? Because remember, democracy's messy and it's complicated and it takes forever to get anything done. It's so much easier when you have one party that comes in and says, this is what we're doing, okay? And so that's what they're trying to do. And so the United States is uncomfortable with this because this, again, our system's supposedly based on a two-party system. And so we're going to use the Marshall Plan. This is, again, George Marshall, that architect of the World War II, is going to be the architect of the Cold War and of this, let's funnel resources into Europe so they can rebuild. They can rebuild their roads, they can rebuild their factories, they can rebuild their schools and their hospitals. And so this is kind of where the United States begins to have this real global kind of presence. And of course, all of this is part of globalization. Now, in the 1950s, this is a great thing, right? Because, you have global investment and you have, the other countries have not fully recovered yet. So, everyone's buying stuff from the United States. So there's great prosperity in the 1950s because of the economic system. Now, the Marshall Plan is highly, highly successful. Think about trying to rebuild France, trying to rebuild Italy, without the Marshall Plan. It would have taken so much longer. You would have had a lot more radicalization, that kind of thing. So he's very successful in doing that. But eventually this Marshall Plan is going to kind of bite us in the butt. Not really. Okay, maybe not. Maybe that's an over-exaggeration. But globalization will eventually, by 1970, right, these other countries that we initially helped rebuild will be highly competitive with the United States. And that's going to end up becoming an issue for us as we move into the 1970s. So you want to be sure you know the Marshall Plan. State of Texas would ask you pretty simple questions about that, really. You have China. We've talked about that already, the Korean War. Big thing with the Korean War, I mentioned MacArthur, the partitioning at the 38th parallel. You need to know that. You need to know that the Korean War, this is a big part of why Eisenhower gets elected. On top of the fact, well, he's Eisenhower, and his famous campaign slogan is, "We like Ike," and everybody did. This is the guy that was the supreme Allied commander in World War II. What's not to like, right? And so he comes in, he very quickly brings about an end to the Korean conflict. And again, this partition system, this idea of containment, if we just keep it in a box, it will eventually collapse. Now, North Korea has not collapsed. Probably because, unlike the Soviet Union, which was massive, North Korea is very small, right? So it has less burden on it, especially when the ruling family doesn't care if people starve. It doesn't do horrible things to them. We're supposed to be doing next year, I think, we're doing a campus reading thing that has to do with North Korea and a lady girl that escaped North Korea. So it'll be really kind of interesting. For you guys, you'll see how that kind of works in, for seniors anyways. So you want to know the Korean conflict. It's over by 1953. You have this armistice. Big thing about that is it's a UN peace action, UN police action. Even though we call it the Korean War, it was not a declared war. Same thing with Vietnam. I think it's important to understand as we move into the post-World War II world, one of the big questions is who gets to declare war, who gets to send troops in. As the world is becoming a bigger place, and as the world is more volatile, the question of how quickly should we respond, who gets to make that decision. So the executive power has really gained as far as the commander-in-chief role. Now, Korea, I don't know, was so much a part of that because it was UN, but certainly with the Vietnam War, you see it with some of the actions that take place in the 1980s. The Gulf War was a UN action. Afghanistan and Iraq had congressional approval, but yeah, so it gets kind of interesting when you start to look at it. Okay, so the other thing that happens, so the U.S. has all these nuclear missiles. We have all this nuclear technology. We're building weapons. Eisenhower, when he wins in '52, again, I think I mentioned this before, he doesn't like sending soldiers to die. So he's much friendlier to the idea of nuclear weapons. And what this essentially does is it creates a sense of mutually assured destruction. That really we're making these weapons, and as long as we have parity, right, equality between how many nuclear weapons the Soviets have and how many nuclear weapons we have, we're not really going to use them because we would all die. Well, that's true until you get to 1957. And all of a sudden, the Soviets launched Sputnik. Okay? I mean, talk about panic. There's a documentary called Sputnik Mania. I mean, people freak out. They're like, oh my gosh, they're going to drop a nuclear weapon on us from space. There's not going to be anything we can do. We won't know it's coming, all this kind of stuff. Well, this is largely, hysteria. Because Sputnik is really just a radio transmitter. It's a blinking light bulb and a radio transmitter that's, orbiting the Earth. But the fact that the Soviets were developing this was huge. Now, some of this goes back to that post-World War II, like technology, expertise, art grab that happens, right? Because everybody, the U.S. and the Soviets, are grabbing as many experts from Germany as they could. In fact, if you've ever watched the movie October Sky, it talks about the Braun guy or whatever, he really was a Nazi, right? And we're perfectly okay. Well, we're going to ignore all that. Although I don't know to what extent he was really a Nazi. Who knows, right? So I think it's interesting to recognize that the Soviets beat the U.S. to this, right? The U.S. is so focused on our mutually assured destruction and, getting out of the Korean War. And, of course, at the same time, you've also got the McCarthyism that takes hold. Because McCarthy comes in, and as you're looking at NSC 68 and the long telegram and the testing of the nuclear bomb by the Soviets, there's a lot of concern about espionage. Oh, my goodness, they're spying on us. And there's some legitimacy to that, okay? You've got a thing called the Venona Papers, which I don't think will be on the standards. I think they've pulled that off now. It used to be on the standards. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, they sold, well, she didn't really. She kind of unwittingly helped her husband. But he was kind of low-level spying. I don't know that they really got any damaging information. The Rosenbergs get executed, actually, for espionage. So revisionist historians will question that because they didn't really pass along any important information or information the Soviets didn't already have. The Soviets had been spying on the United States since the Manhattan Project. They had moles in the Manhattan Project. People that were concerned about the U.S. having that kind of power unilaterally. And so, there really is spying. Is it widespread? No. But because remember that this Cold War is not just about the military, it's ideological. It's about how we think, how we live, what we believe. It's about, how our families are structured. In the Pledge of Allegiance, the one nation under God, the under God part was not added until 1954. We did not say one nation under God. We said one nation indivisible. So, when people point to, oh, it's one nation under God, that's why we're a Christian nation. Well, no, because that's out of context. The context of one nation under God is to define us as apart from the Soviets and their atheism. Because in Stalinist Russia, what you have is a cult of personality that said nothing should interfere with your devotion to the Communist Party as it's led by Stalin or by Stalin's successor, right? So, religious faith, there was not room for that in the Soviet Union. This is one of the things as you get to, to Gorbachev, that he'll start to allow churches to reopen, and, and it becomes less of a controversial thing to attend church. So just little things like that. The idea about women, right? In the Soviet Union, because it's, we're all treated the same, it's the workers' party, right? Women had a great deal of equality, at least as far as the workplace was concerned. Well, in the United States, the emphasis in the 1950s was women, you need to go home, have babies, make cookies, take care of your husband. Now, some of that is a natural result of soldiers coming home, they miss their wives, the world has changed, let's make babies, right? So some of that is a natural result of women saying, okay, well, somebody's got to take care of the kids, right? And so I don't want you to think that it was all kind of part of a propaganda campaign. But there's definitely a strand, especially the farther into the 1950s that you get, once you get out of the initial baby boom phase, right, of 48, 49, 50, 51. As you get to 57, 58, 59, 60, and in the early 60s, one of the issues is that women are often told, well, this is what your proper role is. Well, the notion of this gender role is defined by the fact, well, in the Soviet Union, women are treated equally, right? Women have jobs in factories, and, their kids go to these state-sponsored preschools. And yes, they do, and I'm not advocating for state-sponsored preschools. But I am saying that some of what the 1950s society is about is not just the product of common sense, which is everybody had babies and somebody has to take care of them, but it's also the product of kind of this overall mentality that we are not the Soviet Union. We do things differently here, okay? And how do we define, so it's kind of like anything the Soviet Union does, we're going to do the opposite of. And so, yes, you definitely have a very, very strict gender roles in the 1950s. And those gender roles will continue into the 1960s until you start to have the women's movement emerging, that's questioning that. Because remember, women were extremely important in the World War II effort. They got careers in the military. They worked in factories. And those women, for all of that kind of society for about 10 or 15 years, kind of shuffles them off to the side. That experience, that collective experience, doesn't disappear. And so that's part of why you're going to see the women's movement, re-emerging again in a very different way and pushing back against gender roles. Because the gender roles, like I said, while some of it's common sense, just natural result of having so many kids at one time, it's also kind of part of this societal, we're not the Soviet Union. So I kind of veered off into society. So Sputnik gets launched, right? So you have this overall concern with the space race, right? So we didn't expect that the Soviets would be able to get this technology and this whole big grab. The U.S. had not been developing space technology, okay? All of a sudden in 1957 we panicked. And we're like, oh my gosh, right, what's going to happen? And so you have an immediate switch where Eisenhower's like, we're going to create the NASA. So massive funding to NASA to develop our own space program. Our first attempt was, explodes. It takes a while before we get that up and going. National Defense Education Act funnels a ton of money into the schools, that our schools are falling behind. This is why, the Soviet Union beat us. Well, the Soviet Union beat us not because our schools were falling behind, but because they stole scientists and forced them to work, and, because in a communist society, it's very efficient to say, this is what we're going to do. And, and everything's towards that one thing, as opposed to a democratic society where we're doing all these, we have all these plates in the air. So you want to know the space race. And the space race does not just it begins with Sputnik, okay? But it encompasses NASA and the NDEA. And it gets magnified when John F. Kennedy wins the presidency in 1960, and he gives his famous, challenge that by the end of this decade, we are going to put a man on the moon. And you have the Apollo program. And the result of this space race, and this is something the STAR test will like to throw in, is satellite technology, telecommunications, internet, silly things like Velcro. And, different types of food, and practical things like medicine and fire-resistant materials. So there's all these things that develop because of the space race. So understand that the space race is kind of one of the core elements of innovation of the 20th century. So you need it for the start. They want you to know that. You need to know space race, innovation, have kind of an idea what comes out of it. Now, as far as the Cold War is concerned, what happens is, especially for a number of years, you have this race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, where they're constantly, at first it's just satellites, and then it's, putting animals in the moon. I think the U.S. sends a monkey, and the Soviets send a dog, and then it's men. They're sending men up and down, and then men are orbiting, and then they're sending women, or actually the Soviets send women. The U.S. doesn't until the 1980s, but. So you have, again, kind of the difference there. But the U.S. will put a man on the moon in 1969. So we will do that within a decade. And really, when you think about it, you're talking 12 years after Sputnik. That's a pretty rapid pace of development. And this is a part of the Cold War, this military strategy. And it's a government program. Make no mistake, NASA is a government program. So as we're thinking about in terms of what, the STAR tests, like, especially as you get to the end of kind of their units, they like to talk a lot about, what is the role of government and how do we feel about certain governmental involvements and stuff like that. Programs like NASA are just as much a government program as Social Security, okay? Yes, they do different things. And you can argue NASA and space race spur innovation, and perhaps Social Security doesn't. But they're still both government programs, okay? So I think it's important to recognize. And, we see that with the current budget, right, where they're wanting to cut the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Institute of Health and that kind of stuff. Well, those are innovation kind of inspiring organizations, but they're government programs. So what government programs are we okay with? So you have the space race happening as we're building up nuclear weapons, as we have kind of this ideological idea of creating our own society. We're also going to see domino theory. Domino theory was particularly powerful in Asia, and this is what you see Eisenhower doing. So Eisenhower doesn't want to send soldiers in, so we have the mutually assured destruction, you have the space race. But he also believes in containment. And his theory is if we let South Korea fall, then other countries will fall. So when you get to Vietnam, when you get to the Vietnam conflict, if we let Vietnam fall, or French Indochina, whatever, depending on what year you're talking about, if we let that fall to communism, that will spread to Laos, Cambodia, it'll spread to India, who knows where it might spread to. We have to stop those dominoes from falling. And so this is going to be a big driver in American policy in Asia. It's a little bit of a driver as far as the Middle East is concerned, but particularly with Asia. This is why we keep kind of dabbling with these different things. This is why under Eisenhower, you see him relying heavily on the CIA. The CIA does lots of kind of backroom stuff. Iran is one of them, and I mentioned that before. So you've got us meddling in stuff to try to prevent dominoes from falling. And that's kind of the best way to mention it. Now, in Vietnam, under Eisenhower, what he's going to start to do is essentially funnel resources. Initially, the French are fighting, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh in kind of a guerrilla conflict. And we're sending advisors, we're sending weapons. By the time you get to like 1954, we're funding most of that conflict. But in 1954, you have a battle called Dien Bien Phu, where essentially the Viet Minh kick France's tail, even though France had all this military equipment from the United States. And this causes us to go to the Geneva Accords, right, which is essentially this promise that we're going to allow Vietnam to have an election, doesn't this sound familiar, to decide what they want to be, right? In the meantime, we're going to partition because we love partitions, right? North Vietnam, which is where kind of Ho Chi Minh, his stronghold is, they get to be Communist in South Vietnam gets to be democratic. We'll have a couple of years for everyone to catch their breath. And then we'll have this election. Except, right, that's not ever allowed to happen. So this is all going on under Eisenhower. And Eisenhower is kind of creating this environment that where, again, partitioning is good, and where he's trying to support, like I said, keep dominoes from falling all over the place by whatever means necessary, whether that's using that Truman Doctrine process or whatever. Arms race is a big one. The buildup of weapons, the buildup of tanks, the buildup of planes, anything having to do with the military. That's what the NSC 68 is all about. And when you think about the domino theory, if we're sending weapons to South Vietnam or to France, if we're sending weapons, to wherever, then obviously we're going to be creating new technology. And because of the space race, we're very concerned about falling behind the Soviet Union. Now, the military-industrial complex is something that he, by the end of his presidency, he's very concerned about. Because, and keep in mind, he's a part of setting this up, which is why he can, I guess, talk about why it's a concern. He gives this speech in January of '61 before he leaves office. And he says, we need to be very concerned about the military-industrial complex, that we have these military industries that are creating more and more and more stuff, and they have all this money, and we're creating this cycle where we have to depend on the existence of a strong military. Okay? Very prophetic in a lot of ways, especially when we get to the 1990s and we look at how, once the Cold War is over, we try to extricate ourselves from this heavy military spending, and it starts to become a real issue. So, you kind of want to know the term military-industrial complex. I don't think the STAR test will ask that because it's not quite the bias that Texas likes, but it still might work its way in. Fear of atomic weapons, we'll look at on Tuesday, duck and cover drills. We'll talk about bomb shelters, that kind of thing. This is why in the late 50s, all the cartoons were about spacemen and atomic energy, but people had real legitimate fears about, I'm going to wake up one day and there's going to be an atomic bomb. And so they would have drills at school, much like we have weather drills or fire drills here. They would have duck and cover drills. Everybody get under your desk, right? Because that's going to save you if the atomic bomb falls. But it was about creating, again, remember the emphasis of propaganda, about creating a sense of security and a sense of control, and we got this. We're okay, right? So let's talk about the loyalty oath. So I mentioned spying and espionage. One of the other big concerns. One of the other concerns is that somehow there were spies everywhere, right? So very early on, this begins under Truman. They actually start making teachers sign loyalty oaths, saying that we would not teach things that were not that encouraged questioning our country. That supported communism. We wouldn't teach those things. Concerned that it's coming from these teachers. It's all their fault. So that's a concern. There's also concern about the media, about Hollywood, television. Television's beginning to develop and take off during this period. What is Hollywood saying? This is where you get McCarthyism, kind of the list, the blacklist, right? There's been some stuff out lately about different artists that had to deal with trying to work during the 50s and the McCarthy era. McCarthy is this guy from, Wisconsin? Joseph McCarthy comes in. He was kind of part of an anti-communism. I said the other day that a lot of the Cold War is about, what is your stance on communism, right? Well, La Follette, not this progressive the dad, but the son, he loses the election to McCarthy. And McCarthy does this because he talks a lot about, I'm not going to talk on communism, and we have to worry about those, pesky Reds and all that kind of stuff. Well, he comes in, and he ends up getting on the House Un-American Activities Committee. Now, HUAC was created initially towards, right at the beginning of World War II, And it's really the House Un-American Activities Committee was kind of keeping an eye on American Nazis, because the American Nazi Party had, I mean, there's some pictures out on the internet of their rallies in like 38, 39, that kind of thing. So this is kind of the origin of HUAC. Not a huge deal until you get to really the late 1940s, and this is when the concern comes in that maybe we need to have people sign loyalty oaths. And so under Truman's administration, they start having people sign loyalty oaths. People in government, people in any kind of, and that was not just federal government, but it was also like state government. And so what will happen is that, you know, when you get to like 50, I think McCarthy comes in around 50. And by the time you get to 1952, you have McCarthy kind of running these hearings. And McCarthy famously has this thing where he says, I have a list of State Department employees who have, you know, are not loyal to the United States, they've not signed the loyalty oaths, or they were members of the Communist Party. Now, he never produces this infamous list, okay? He never says, here it is, look at it, everybody see. These are the names. He never turns it over to the CIA, nothing like that, okay? He just says he has it. And everybody kind of gets crazy about it. Oh my gosh, wow, there's spies in the State Department. And they start having these hearings, and then this is where you start to have this idea of that Hollywood is betraying us. They're creating films that convince people that the Soviet way of life is the right way, and questioning the American way of life, and all this kind of stuff. And so they start bringing in artists and musicians and singers and writers and you name it, and investigating them. But they're also investigating government employees, okay? And McCarthy will continue this, and this imaginary list keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and he keeps getting more and more attention, okay? So he's getting all this attention for having this list until he crosses the line. He starts to say that in the Army there are communists, okay? And he goes after this one guy who had fought in World War II or whatever, and essentially this, you know, senators stand up to him and they say, you know, or was a lawyer for the Army, I'm sorry, not a senator, stands up to him and says, you know, have you no shame? And this is when, and of course Eisenhower hated McCarthy, so I'm sure some of it has to do with President Eisenhower winning the election and being like, yeah, this dude's got to go, you know. So McCarthy ends up kind of losing the next election, kind of rides off into the sunset, drinks himself to death. Yeah, not particularly stable. Not a proud moment in American history, right? I mean, here we had Japanese American internment camps. You think we would have learned something about what our American values are. It doesn't take much, but the Soviets having an atomic bomb and us being afraid of mutually assured destruction to start targeting anybody. And remember the Depression, right? In the Depression, going to a Communist Party meeting was no big deal, right? It was just another idea. It was like, you know, going to Bernie Sanders' rally. Let's just go see what this is all about, you know. And then you see, like, Lucille Ball, her grandfather wanted them to sign up, you know, and so they kind of did it as kind of a gesture for him before he died. And I mean, like, lots of crazy stuff like that. So McCarthyism, if you've read The Crucible, that's kind of a good picture of that. So you want to be sure you kind of get the idea of the espionage thing. And then you've got, as we're moving out of the 1950s, you've got the Bay of Pigs crisis. So Cuba has a revolution. Cuba, that of course we, you know, kind of bossed around since the Spanish-American War, and we had allowed American investments to really take advantage of Cuba. It's not that it was like horrendous, but clearly American businesses had the advantage. Clearly there was a plutocracy where you had a handful of Cuban elites that made lots of money and everybody else was really, really poor. And the United States didn't really worry about that too much, right? Because they were following the rules that we had set. Well, there starts to be this revolution. And this revolution, of course, has very much a communist flavor to it. And it's led by Fidel Castro. He manages to take over. This is like 58, 59. Takes over Cuba, kicks out the government. So you have all these Cuban exiles. You know, Ted Cruz's father was one of those exiles that, you know, had good jobs, were kind of part of that upper middle class. And then you have, you know, they have to leave in order to protect themselves. And Castro's left in charge. Well, the U.S. decides to take a hard line against that, right? We don't launch an invasion right away because, remember, Eisenhower doesn't like to send soldiers in. But we do have a lot of sanctions. We cut off diplomatic ties, all this kind of stuff, right? And we're not very happy about that. And in the meantime, the CIA starts developing this plan to help these exiles from Cuba basically retake their own country. Okay? Well, we're not directly involved. We're just kind of helping and aiding, just like we've been doing, right? So the presidential election happens. Castro's taking a hard line against the U.S. The U.S. is taking a hard line against Cuba and Castro. And JFK wins the 60 election, comes in 61, and the CIA shows up at the first meeting and they say, hey, President Kennedy, we've got a plan for you. We're going to solve that Cuban question. And remember, Democrats had fought this perception that they were weak on communism. So what Kennedy's thinking is, hey, if I take a hardline stance, I'll look tough on communism. Well, the CIA convinces him that Eisenhower was more excited about this plan than he was. Eisenhower, it's kind of like the raid that Trump did in January or whatever, or early February, that had been brought to Obama, and the Obama administration said, yeah, this is not ready to go yet. Okay, so we need to put this on the back burner. Well, and Trump comes in and they tell him about it. He's like, yeah, let's go do it, right? So it's kind of the same idea. Eisenhower's administration said, yeah, we're not ready to do this. We're not sure about it. We have questions. They take it to John F. Kennedy. They sell it to him like, yeah, this plane's ready to go. And he authorizes it, in part for some of the same reason that Trump authorized his Yemen raid, which is I want to look tough on fill in blank, right? So they authorize this Bay of Pigs invasion. So they train these Cuban exiles. They're supposed to be landed on a beach by American ships. They're supposed to kind of gain a beachhead, and then the Americans will provide air support. Except it doesn't work that way. Okay? They get their butts kicked on the beach. And essentially Castro's forces round them up. And Kennedy, at the last minute, pulls the air support. He says, no, we're not doing this. And so the Bay of Pigs looks really, really embarrassing, makes him look really, really weak. This is a complication. By 61, you've got some civil rights stuff going on. And so Kennedy's feeling kind of, the big problem with this is that this upsets Castro, understandably, right? He's like, the U.S. is out to get me. Well, they really were. They had numerous assassination plots and all kinds of stuff. But, so he's not real happy about that, so he invites the Soviet Union to put nuclear missiles in Cuba, thinking, hey, if the Soviet Union has nuclear missiles here, the U.S. wouldn't dare attack Cuba because, well, then that would mean that they were attacking the Soviet Union, okay? The Soviet Union says, yeah, they've got United States' weapons in Turkey. They can reach Moscow. We can't reach Washington, D.C. We should have the same benefit that they have. Remember, this is mutually assured destruction, right? So they start building these missile silos. Well, U.S. spy planes catch the pictures, and they take it to Kennedy, in 1962, and they're like, yeah, this is what's happening. And Kennedy immediately blockades Cuba, stops the shipment of these silo supplies. And remember, blockades, just like embargoes, are kind of dicey. Like, they can be perceived as a little bit aggressive. And so what's going to happen is that you have about 6 days in 1962 where everyone's thinking, oh my gosh, we're about to go to war. Because Russia gets really mad. What will happen is that Kennedy and Khrushchev will sit down and they'll be like, yeah, we really don't want to do this. We're really not going to do this. And so basically they kind of step back. They choose, basically the Soviets remove their missiles from Cuba, the U.S. removes their missiles from Turkey, which incidentally we were going to remove anyways, right? And so you have kind of this agreement to kind of like just calm things down. And it kind of begins to open up a little bit of improved communication. Of course, now this is after Khrushchev had started building the Berlin Wall, because that was 61. So you have the U-2 spy plane in like 59, 60. You've got the Berlin Wall 61, the Bay of Pigs in 61, and then 62 is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Khrushchev and Kennedy say, okay, we're going to back off, right? And there's a famous cartoon that sometimes the Star Test use of, Kennedy with his finger on a button, Khrushchev with his finger on a button, and they're sitting on nuclear missiles. So we avoid that whole thing. And it really kind of tells you that nuclear missiles are not all that, right? If you have them and you don't want to use them, then why do you have them, right? So this is what the big quiz. This is why we don't want places like North Korea to have one, because they might actually use one. All right, so we'll finish this up on Tuesday, and with what time we have left. Oh crap! What time we have left, which we probably don't have. We'll do videos or documents.
It's not all about this. It's about history, or more about like everything else. Okay, so I was watching this show called like but there's this part where they're having like problems with like I don't remember what it is. But they were like having problems with them or whatever that came over, and they had like a diplomat or whatever, which I'm not really even sure what that is. But they had like this like building or whatever, but like it's in the U.S. but like other people like can't, like the U.S. people can't get into it. That's like their country's building in the U.S. like a diplomatic building. Like, is that a thing?
Yes. You can have an embassy when you go to an embassy, it is treated as though it is foreign soil. So, like for instance, Julian Assange with WikiLeaks is actually staying in the Ecuadorian embassy so that he doesn't get arrested, because if he's in Ecuador, he's okay, but he can't step out of the embassy without possibly being arrested. So, yes, so when you're actually, it's one of the diplomatic privileges of other countries.
But like, why is that necessary? Like, why do we have
So that, the idea is that we have that in other countries. So in other countries, we have embassies where it's basically U.S. territory. So if you get into that embassy, you are technically in American soil, and people can't get to
It's
you.
just
They
a way
can't
to be
tap
safe in another country. Kind of.
Yeah, and that's why when you get to the Iranian hostage crisis, it's perceived as kind of an attack on the United States, because they go into the embassy. The Benghazi attack is, that's an attack on an embassy. You're right, it's not technically American territory, but it provides a basis for, we have enough of a relationship that we have a spot that we call ours, that we can run things how we want. If you don't have that, then you don't have a conversation going on.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Got you. Okay. I was just, that was weird.
Yeah, no, but it really does exist.
Yeah.
That's great. I have a question. So for the quizzes, they're like on Google Drive. There's like a lot more PowerPoints.
Yes.
And so, how are you gonna quiz us then? Like, we have to look over the PowerPoints ourselves.
Yes, that's what I said. You have to be responsible for your own learning on this one. I can go over the high points and kind of help emphasize the points.
Yeah.
But you're going to have to look over those PowerPoints that are related to the Cold War or whatever I'm talking, the kind of the overview part.
Yeah.
And then I suggest you read something to provide some context.
Okay, and that's the American Yawp one.
Yawp or the HIST book or something like that.
Okay.
And if you're still kind of struggling with, I'm having trouble putting this together, like there's all kinds. I mean, I've got lecture videos over most of this stuff. Now, some of them are 90 minutes long, which, why not just read about it? But there's some that, there are some that I've done over the last couple of years that are shorter. But there's also like Crash Course and that kind of stuff. You might even could check. I'm trying to think. I have some, because this year when I've done videos for my regular and honors, they're not more than 10 minutes.
Okay.
But really, you're probably getting that for here, with what I'm doing in class. But yeah, so there's all kinds of ways you can supplement that if you're having trouble with making sense of it all.
Okay.
I would definitely kind of, if you look at the PowerPoints that I'm sharing with dual credit come from my regular and honors, because we're covering so much material. And over the years, I've refined the slides so that they focus on what's fair game for the test. So, the one thing that I would encourage you to do is to look over the PowerPoints, because that's the foundation for the quizzes. That's the foundation for the STAR. Now, again, if
because of our time crunch, my ability to give you context is
Yeah.
extremely limited. That's why you should go read something else.
Okay.
Or, I mean, if you really hate reading, I mean, if you're watching the crash course videos, especially this period, the post World War II crash course videos are particularly good and
Okay.
very well aligned with what I do. Now, when you get to the earlier stuff, sometimes it's hit and miss, but the later stuff, anything that's, really 1920s forward, it really dovetails with what we're doing. So you could always
Okay.
do that as well.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And I already posted the Socrative for the Cold War, so you can also look at that as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.